Shalom, and welcome to Through the Book of Enoch, Lesson 2. In our first lesson, we never actually got into the actual text of the Book of Enoch. And so this lesson, we're actually going to get into the meat of the actual book itself. The Book of Enoch is, of course, as we'll talk about later, the oldest book on earth. We have a number of handouts for your study, and the first handout is the outline of the Book of Enoch, which I put together several years ago. I hope it'll be useful to you in your continuing Enoch studies. It goes through the entire book, outlining it in a very logical, structured format that will perhaps assist you in your studies. So we're going to start in Enoch chapter 1, verse 1. Put the outline over here. Chapter 1, verse 1. And in the very first verse of the Book of Enoch, we're told who the Book of Enoch was really written for. By the way, there are many translations of the Book of Enoch. I will be using for this class my own translation, which you can get by going to NazareneSpace.com and clicking on Books and DVDs, and it's the Books of Enoch. It has First and Second Enoch in it. First Enoch is translated primarily, wherever possible, from the Aramaic fragments that were found at Qumran. And then the rest is translated from the Greek, and some places even that's not possible, from Ethiopic. So some of it's from Aramaic, some of it looks at all of it, some of it looks at the Greek. It's sort of tries to be the best of all worlds of the three primary language versions of the Book of Enoch. And as we talked about last week, in its entirety, the book only has survived in Ethiopic. So we begin with the first verse. The words of the blessing with which Enoch blessed the chosen and righteous, who will be living in the day of tribulation, when all the wicked and godless are to be removed. So this very first verse tells us something very important. The Book of Enoch was written for those that would be living in the tribulation and who would see the tribulation. And I would even generalize more as we read in, skipping ahead quite a bit to the end of the book, in chapter 108, verse 1. There's a parallel statement in 1 Enoch 108:1. Another book which Enoch wrote for his son Methuselah, for those who will come after him and keep the Torah in the last days. So those that would be Torah observant in the last days are the target for the Book of Enoch. I don't know that my generation, I'm nearly 50, will see the tribulation. Maybe. Things are certainly lining up so that we could. In a broader sense of the term, one might say that we're already sort of entering into the tribulation. But as far as the 7-year tribulation and the 3.5-year period that the scripture actually clearly refers to as the tribulation, obviously that time, in my opinion, that time has not come yet. But it is imminent. So the Book of Enoch was written for us. And it's interesting that the Hebrew and Aramaic, well, the Hebrew's been totally lost so far. Perhaps the Hebrew will come to light. There are rumors. John Strugnell, who was one of the original Dead Sea Scroll team members, claimed to have been aware of a complete Hebrew copy that was found at Qumran that was still in the hands of Bedouins that had never been procured, and it was, I believe he said it was in Jordan, and that it was rumored to exist at least. So perhaps the original Hebrew will come to light someday. However, there was also an Aramaic version, and 7 fragmentary copies of the Aramaic version were found among the Dead Sea Scrolls. And as you know, the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 1947, just a year before Israel was restored as a nation. I think there's something very prophetically important about the fact that the 7 fragmentary Aramaic copies of Enoch were not discovered until 1 year before the modern restoration of the modern nation of Israel in 1948. Until then, they stayed in clay jars. And actually, it's a little bit misleading because the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered in 47, but I don't believe Cave 4 with the Enoch Scrolls was discovered until just a few short years later in the early 1950s. So, but they coincide closely. And of course, to the Western world, to the Eastern world, really, to everyone except the Ethiopic world, the Book of Enoch was lost from a very early date. We don't know exactly when, 5th or 6th, 9th century, I don't know when, but was lost from ancient times, or relatively ancient times, up until it was brought back in the 1700s by the explorer James the Bruce. And we discussed that last week in our last teaching. So the book was restored in the last days and is being restored in the last days. And I believe that is prophetically fulfilling in itself. The book of Enoch, as we discussed last week, actually implies that its own last days restoration. And so it's for us. It's an important book for us. And so we as Torah observant believers in the last days may find some very important information in this book. And we discussed last week how if we look at what the scriptures say, the book of Enoch is scripture, is inspired, and therefore is profitable for us to grow in our learning and understanding and so on, as Paul says to Timothy. Okay, so it's written for us, and it says when all the wicked and godless are to be removed, which is of course the last days, at the actual judgment. So it's written to those that are going to see that judgment. And the book of Enoch draws a parallel between Enoch's days and our days. Because in Enoch's days, there was this growing sin, transgression. The world was becoming a corrupt place. Sound familiar? And the judgment of Elohim, the flood, was imminent. And in the book of Enoch, it is prophesied continually that the last days will be like that. And then the last days will also be a time in which the world is becoming a corrupt place. Does that sound familiar? And in which not only is the world becoming a corrupt place, but judgment is imminent. And he took his parable and he said, now this word parable here means not a literal parable. In fact, it's used in the Torah at times in this way. It's a discourse, okay, a teaching. And he took his parable and he said, Enoch, a righteous man whose eyes were opened by Elohim, saw the vision of the set apart one in the heavens. And there's more detail about that later in chapter 14. Which angel showed me, and from the words of the watchers, and the watchers are also mentioned in Daniel 4, verse 10 or verse 13, depending on whether you're using a Christian or Jewish version, and verse 14 or verse 17, and verse 20 or verse 23, depending on, basically Daniel chapter 4, verses 10 through 23. The watchers are a term that's used there for angelic beings. And the set apart ones, I heard everything from them, and I understood as I saw. But not for this generation, but for a remote generation shall I speak. So he's speaking to us. And one of the things it says here is that the angel showed him. It says he took up his parable and said, Enoch, a righteous man whose eyes were opened by Elohim, saw the vision of the set apart one in the heavens. And the angel showed me. So what the angels show him in the book of Enoch is, quote, a vision. And that's very, very important. I had someone recently that contacted me and said, Rabbi Trim, I don't understand. I think the book of Enoch is ridiculous because in the astronomical section, it talks about the sun going through portholes and so on and so forth. And all of this is, we know from an astronomical perspective is ridiculous. In light of what we now know about the nature of the Earth, Moon, the Sun, the solar system, and so on. And my response is, and some people also take the journeys of Enoch that we'll read about in the Book of Watchers, and they'll also say, well, this is mythological and whatnot, and we know that this geography is false, and so on. But the problem is that they haven't read the book in context of chapter 1, verse 2. Enoch is describing to us visions. Now, in Daniel chapter 7, when Daniel sees a vision and he sees these different beasts rising up from the sea, a leopard with 4 heads, for example, do we read that and think that that was a literal leopard rising out of the water with 4 heads that Daniel saw? Of course not. That a vision is a vision. It's an allegorical representation. So as we read the book of Enoch, we have to understand that the things that the angels were showing Enoch were allegorical. They must be understood on an allegorical, a drosh level, an allegorical, homiletical level. Verse 3, concerning the chosen, I said, and took up my parable concerning them, the set apart one will come forth from his dwelling. So now we're looking forward to the last day when Yahweh comes to the earth. And the eternal Elohim will tread upon the earth, even on Mount Sinai, and appear with his mighty army, and appear in the strength of his might from the heaven of heavens. It's interesting that in the book of Enoch, Yahweh coming to the earth is seen as coinciding with or occurring at Mount Sinai, because it is a time when the renewal of the Torah takes place, the renewal of the covenant takes place, and it parallels the revelation of Yahweh at the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai. And this is, I think, important. Now, some will say, well, other texts talk about Yahweh when he returns to the earth, returning to the Mount of Olives. And there are other passages that we can debate about. However, there's an interesting midrash. I don't have the passage on me, but there is an interesting midrash that talks about the different mountains of the earth becoming one at the time that the Messiah comes. Okay, and all shall be smitten with fear. And all shall be smitten with fear, and the watchers shall quake, shall quake. And they shall be punished in hidden places among all the creatures of the earth. And all the creatures of the earth shall quake, and great fear and trembling shall seize them to the ends of the earth. And the high places shall be shaken, and the high hills shall be made low, and shall melt like wax before the flame. There are many, many passages in the scripture that parallel this event, also in the book of Enoch itself. Enoch 52:6, Micah 1:4, Nahum 1:5, Psalms 97:5, Isaiah 34:3, Revelation 6:14, Isaiah 64:1, and Amos 9:5. One may understand this then in light of Revelation 6:14 as coinciding with the sixth seal. And the earth shall be wholly rent in sunder, and all that is upon the earth shall perish, and there shall be judgment upon all men. But with the righteous he will make shalom, or peace, and will protect the chosen, and mercy shall be upon them, and they shall all belong to Elohim, and shall be prospered, and they shall all be blessed, and he will help them all. And light shall appear unto them. Both the Messiah and the Torah are allegorically represented by light in the scriptures. And behold, he comes with myriads of his set-apart ones. We're getting here now to verse 9. Verse 9 is very important, 1 Enoch 1:9, because it is the verse that is quoted in the book of Jude, chapter 1, verses 14 through 15. Okay? And that also means that we can study the book of Jude to find out more about these people, the whole of the book of Jude. We're going to do that more when I do through the book of Jude, but we'll also do it more as this study continues and we look at various passages of Jude that tie in. I don't want to go there now because, unfortunately, we would be revealing things that are further on in the book of Enoch to do so. Also, the book of 2nd Kepha, or 2nd Peter, is really a commentary on the book of Jude. So chapters 2 and 3 of the book of 2nd Peter, or 2nd Kepha, closely parallel that of the book of Jude and elaborate on each of the statements that Jude is making. So we can actually learn more about these people, not only by looking at Jude, but by looking at 2nd Kepha, so Yehuda in 2nd Kepha. Yehuda is the Hebrew name of the book of Jude. And so we will do that when we do through the book of Jude and through 2nd Kepha, which may be done together because of that. But that'll be another series. However, throughout these studies, we will look at Jude and 2nd Kepha. And it says, and behold, he comes with myriads of his set-apart ones to execute judgment upon all, and to destroy all the ungodly, and to convict all flesh concerning all the works of their ungodliness, which they have ungodly committed, and all the proud and hard things which ungodly sinners have spoken against him. I think we will go to the book of Jude, and I don't want to go too far into the book of Jude because the book talks about so much more that's in the book of Enoch that we haven't gotten to yet. But there are some things here I think we should cover real quickly about these people without going that far. Verses 14 through 15 are 14 and 15 are the actual quotations from the book. If we start with, and we go on to verse 16, it elaborates on who these people are. It says, these are murmurers, complainers, walking according to their own lusts, and their mouth speaks great swelling words, flattering people to gain advantage. And if we go to 2nd Kepha, or 2nd Peter, chapter 3, chapter 2 actually, verse 18, for when they, this is, if you compare Jude and 2nd Peter together, this is where Kepha begins to talk about the same material that we find there in Jude and therefore in the book of Enoch. For when they speak great swelling words of emptiness, they allure through the lust of the flesh, through perversion, those who have actually escaped from those who live in error. And verse 19, I think, is very important. While they promise them liberty, They themselves are slaves to corruption. For whom a person is overcome, by him also he is brought into bondage. For if they have escaped the pollutions of the world through the knowledge of the Adon and Savior, Yeshua the Messiah, they are again entangled in them and overcome. The latter end is worse for them than the beginning. For it would have been better for them not to have known the way of righteousness than after they had known it to turn from the set-apart commandment delivered to them. But this has happened to them according to the true proverb, the dog returns to his own vomit, and the sow that had washed her wallowing in the mire. And we can read more, and we will in our study of 2 Kepha, but I want to center in on particularly this phrase in verse 19, while they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves to corruption. Okay, and Jude says about these people that they have turned this into perversion. Now, we are seeing this happen right now in the modern day. Okay, it began, and we'll find out more about this as we study into the book of Enoch. It began long ago with the teaching that the law is not for today. The law is not for today teachers teach that we're under grace and therefore not under the law, which is, if you understand those statements, actually true, but they don't understand what under grace and what under the law are. And if you want to learn about that, watch my Through the Book of Romans and Through the Book of Galatians series, which delve into that in much detail. But they teach, therefore, that the Torah has been done away with, and we're then, and they talk about freedom in Christ, or liberty in Christ. And that freedom to them is the freedom to disobey the Torah. And the law is not for today, then they would say, because we're under grace and we have all this freedom and liberty and so on. Okay. However, in the Torah, freedom and liberty, and in the Tanakh, in the scriptures, freedom and liberty are not the freedom to disobey the Torah. To the contrary, in the Psalms, David writes that I will walk according to your ordinances or your commandments. I don't remember exactly which word he uses, and then he says, and I will walk at liberty. Okay? So, Paul says these people aren't really, they're pretending to present liberty with their words, with their blasphemous words, but that what they're really delivering is corruption and sin, and sin is not liberty at all. Okay, and so Paul's saying it's a false. They're guilty of false advertising. They're promising with their words, their false words, liberty, but they're delivering bondage to sin. Okay. This is very important because Paul identifies that. Jude and Kepha collectively are taking the message of these that are being judged in the last days in 1 Enoch 1:9 and is applying it to Christianity, if you will. The teaching that, and by the way, when I first started teaching on that topic 25 years ago, one of the things I did was I actually took some pamphlets that were published by the Metropolitan Community Church, which is I guess it still exists, it's the gay church. It was the gay church then. Now there's several mainline churches that are embracing it. And so I don't even know that they have a reason to exist anymore. But at the time, I was pulling out quotes. They were making that argument, that they were arguing that homosexuality was acceptable and permissible because we're under grace, and homosexuality, they paralleled to the idea in Christianity that you can eat pork because you're not under the law. You can eat lobster because you're not under the law. And therefore, if you have the liberty to violate those Old Testament purity laws and whatnot, that you can violate the commandments against homosexuality, because that's Old Testament stuff that's been done away with. And I would quote these things and I would say, look, you may not think that the Christian teaching that the law has been done away with, that anybody would be actually out there teaching that meant homosexuality was okay and that sexual perversion was okay. Okay, you may not think that, but that there were people out there that were making that argument. Now, when I was making that claim in the late 1980s and quoting those, what were at the time bizarre materials, I could not have imagined that by the year 2015 we would see mainline churches embracing that theology. But that's where we come, and of course that's where the theology logically leads. And so there you have it. And so both Kepha and Jude predict that outcome which we are living in today, and that is what they say Enoch is addressing here, because Enoch is talking in terms of the sexual immorality of the angels, the fallen angels, which we will find, which Jude and Kepha both mention earlier in their letters, but which Enoch hasn't gotten to yet. So let's move on to chapter 2, verse 1. Consider you all his doings of the heavens, how they do not change their orbits, and the luminaries which are in the heaven, how in the station of their lights, that all rise and set in order, each in its season, and transgress not against their appointed order. Behold, so he says, look at the laws of nature, the laws, what we would call today the laws of physics, and the orbits of the movements of the objects in the heavens, the heavenly bodies, and how they follow their certain rules and they don't depart from them. You can predict them. They're very predictable. Once you understand the science of it, you can predict their movements. Behold, the earth, and give heed to its works from first to last, and steadfast they are, how none of these things change, and everything appears to you. Behold, the signs of summer, and clouds, and dew, and winter, from the whole earth is filled with water, and the clouds pour down rain. Observe and see how in the winter all the trees wither and shed all their leaves, except 14 trees, which do not lose their foliage, but retain the old foliage until 2 or 3 years past. We just finished chapter 3 because bam, bam, bam. One thing about the book of Enoch is that the chapter divisions sometimes only have 3 verses. In chapter 3, only 1 verse. Again, in chapter 4, 1 verse. Chapter 4, and again, observe you the days of summer, how the sun burns and glows, and you seek shade and shelter before it on the burning earth, and you cannot tread on the earth or on a rock by reason of the heat. Chapter 5, verse 1. Observe you all the trees cover themselves, on all of them their leaves grow green, and all of their fruit is brought forth in glorious pride. Praise you and give you heed, and know with regard to all these works, and recognize how he that lives forever has created all of these. Year to year all his works go on thus forever, but they do all his word. Now this also reminds us of what we read in Romans chapter 1 about how the very laws of nature point us to Elohim. Verse 3, observe how the seas and rivers together fulfill and do not change their doings by abandoning his word. In other words, we know we call these the law of hydraulics, the laws of hydraulics and fluids, and we learned about in school how we can predict the actions of fluids, okay, and the water cycle. But You have changed your works and have not done the commandments of Yahweh, but you sin against him with great and hard words, with your impure mouths against his greatness. O you hard-hearted, you shall find no shalom. So you people, he's saying, you're not like the laws of physics. The laws of physics are steadfast and do as Yahweh has directed. And you don't do that. You change. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't. You falter. Therefore shall you, he's particularly talking to the wicked and to those that he was speaking of in chapter 1, verse 9, that he judges on the last days because of their harsh words and their false teachings and their, as Kepha says, their teaching, promising liberty but delivering bondage. Therefore shall you curse your days, and the years of your life shall perish, and the years of your destruction shall be multiplied in an everlasting curse, and you shall find no mercy, no chesed, no mercy. In those days you shall make your names an everlasting curse to all the righteous. And by you shall all who curse, and all who are sinners and the ungodly by you shall curse, and all who are without sin shall rejoice, and they shall have remission of sins. This is an interesting God. How can they have remission of sins if they're without sin? Well, they're without sin because they have remission of sins. And all chesed, or all mercy, and shalom, and tranquility, they shall have salvation, the good light. Or it could be read, they shall have Yeshua, the good light. And they shall inherit the land. This is quoted later in Psalm 37:11 and Matthew 5:5. The meek shall inherit the earth, or the meek shall inherit the land. The word there is eretz in Hebrew, erah in Aramaic, which can mean earth, but it can also mean land, particularly the land of Israel, which is in Israel even today referred to simply sometimes as Haaretz, the land. And for all those of the sinners shall have no salvation, and upon you all a curse shall abide. So we have here in the book of Enoch, which is a Tanakh book, if you will. It's not a so-called New Testament book. It's a Jewish book. A concept of the last days, and there are those that have salvation and those that do not have salvation. Very Jewish concept here. And for the chosen, light and grace and shalom. Three beautiful terms. Light, which is often an allegorical reference to the Torah and the Messiah, simultaneously really, because the Torah is the Messiah and the Messiah is the Torah incarnate. And grace, or chesed, and shalom, peace. And they shall inherit the land. It repeats it twice. Here again. They shall inherit the land. But all the godless, there will be a curse. And then there shall be bestowed upon the chosen wisdom. And they shall all live and never again sin. This is beginning the millennial kingdom. Either through ungodliness or through pride, but they who are wise shall be humble, and they shall not again transgress, nor shall they sin all the days of their life. We talked about this in my teaching on the book of Romans, because there, as we read about in the also in the rabbis, which I talk about there, we have two inclinations within us. The inclination to do evil and the inclination to do good. In the millennial kingdom, the days of the Messiah, the inclination to do evil has been destroyed, killed. And in the millennial kingdom, we only have the inclination to do good. So we don't even, transgression and sin, we're not tempted because we don't have an inclination to do evil. Nor shall they die of divine anger or wrath, but they shall complete the number of the days of their lifetime, and their lives shall be increased in shalom, and the years of their joy shall be multiplied in eternal gladness and shalom all the days of their life. And this brings up the interesting question. I believe, based on other passages, that there are two types of people that go into the millennial kingdom. There are Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, and they receive their immortality at the beginning of the millennial kingdom, at the end of the tribulation, at the beginning of the millennial kingdom. And so they receive immortality. They don't die. There are other people who are not part of Am Yisrael, but who are saved, and those people enter into the millennial kingdom with great longevity, as Isaiah talks about. They would die at 100 and be considered young, but they still die, and they would still be bearing children to replace themselves. But they would have very long lives. So we get now to chapter 6, and chapter 6 is really the big one, where the book of Enoch really starts getting into the, chapter 6, it relates to us the information that is the core point of the book of Enoch itself. Okay. And it came to pass when the children of men had multiplied that in those days there were born unto them beautiful and comely daughters. This is paralleling the Torah, Genesis chapter 6, verse 1. In fact, let's go there. And we talked about this in our last lesson also. And it came to pass, and it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, and the sons of Elohim saw the daughters of men that they were fair, they took them wives whomever they chose. Now, there's been dispute about this verse, of these two verses. In verse 2, the sons of Elohim, who were they? And there's two schools of thought in some of the ancient writings about who these sons of Elohim were. One school of thought says that they were men, that they were simply the sons of Seth. The sons of Elohim is a reference to the sons of Seth, as opposed to the sons of Cain, Abel having been eliminated from the equation. And this is the point of view in certain pseudepigraphal books. For example, in the Forgotten Books of Eden volume, there is a first and second books of Adam and Eve, which follows that reasoning. However, beware that particular pseudepigraphal book is considered to be very late as far as pseudepigraphal books go. However, there is another point of view, which is the point of view of the book of Enoch, that these individuals, these sons of Elohim, were angels, angelic beings. The term sons of Elohim is frequently used to refer to angels. And so the book of Enoch here simply identifies them plainly, settles the matter. And the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them. Notice it says the children of heaven in the book of Enoch. It says the sons of Elohim. The word sons is the same in Hebrew, b'nai, for the word children. So that's just a translational issue. But notice it says heaven in Enoch, and it says Elohim. That's really no difference, because there was a tendency by the first century to use euphemisms so as not to use the name or term Elohim too frequently. And so sometimes the term heaven was used as a euphemism for Elohim, of Elohim. But the Aramaic translator translated and used the euphemism heaven here. So the sons and the angels, the children of heaven, saw and lusted after them, and said to one another, "Come, let us choose us wives from among the children of men, and beget us children." And Shemi-Chazah, now, verse 3, first phrase is, and Shemi-Chazah. Now, the Aramaic, depending on what translation you have, you may not have Shemi-Chazah here. The Ethiopic and I believe the Greek have really mangled the names. Okay, one of the things about the translation that I'm using, which is the one I actually produced, is that I have preserved the names here from the Qumran Dead Sea Scroll versions in the Aramaic. So I've retained what are the original names as they appear in the Aramaic text in the Dead Sea Scrolls. And Shemi-Chazah, who was their leader, said unto them, I fear you will not indeed agree to do this deed, and I alone shall have to pay the penalty of a great sin. So it's kind of like they're all gathered together, and Shemi-Chazah comes up with this idea, apparently, I don't know, somebody comes up with this idea, and just following this text. And Shemi-Chazah says, I don't know, I'm afraid that, we'll say go, and I'll be the only one that goes, and the rest of you will be looking at me laughing, and I'll be in judgment, because I did this and nobody else did. So they all bind themselves with a curse, that if we don't all, if we don't all follow through and do this together, then those that didn't have called down a curse upon themselves. So they take an oath bound by a curse. Verse 4, they all answered him and said, let us all swear an oath and all bind ourselves by imprecations or curses, not to abandon this plan, but to do this thing. And they all swore together and bound themselves by imprecations upon it. And they were in all 200 who descended in the days of Yered on the summit of Mount Hermon. And they called it Mount Hermon because they had sworn and bound themselves by curses upon it. And so we have an etymology for the name of Mount Hermon, and we're told that the fallen angels actually touched down on Mount Hermon. And these are, well, let's actually, before we move on to the names, let's move to our first handout. Our first handout is titled Uzzah and Azael in the Talmud, Midrash, and Zohar. And it preserves for us, it has a list here for us, of the tradition of Uzzah, whom, as we continue, you will find parallels Shemi-Chazah, and Azael. Azael has not really come into play yet, but he will. He's a primary character in the book of Enoch. So there were really sort of two leaders among them, and that will come out as the book continues. So let's read about them. First, the Talmud says, in the Babylonian Talmud in Tractate Yoma 67b, the school of Rabbi Ishmael taught, Azael, speaking of the Azael, which is important in the Day of Atonement ceremony. We'll talk about more when we get to Azazel, which is why they're talking about the Azazel. It was so called because it obtains atonement for the affair of Uzzah and Azael. The affair of Uzzah and Azael is what the book of Enoch is about. So the Babylonian Talmud here is referring to the events that are recorded in the book of Enoch. Even though the book of Enoch may not be part of the Tanakh, we read last week how in the Zohar we're told that it was nonetheless regarded as authoritative, regarded as an actual production of Enoch, and it was passed secretly by the rabbis and sages among themselves. Okay? So now we get to, let's look at the next quote. That's very, very, the Babylonian Talmud, that's the only mention it makes of it. Deuteronomy Rabbah, in the Midrash Rabbah, which is the most authoritative Midrash in Judaism. In Deuteronomy Rabbah 11:10, it says, thereupon the soul replied, Master of the universe, two angels, Uzzah and Azael, came down from near your divine presence, and coveted the daughters of the earth, and they corrupted their way upon the earth, until you did suspend them between earth and heaven. And we're going to remember this about them being suspended between earth and heaven, because that's going to come in later, maybe not this week, depending on how far we get in the book this week, when we talk about the midrash of Shimei Chazah and Azazel, which is, we're not going to cover that here because it's longer and it goes into things that the book of Enoch hasn't gotten into yet. Now let's look at the Zohar, volume 1, page 37a, and we start to get a little bit more information now as we're getting. So we've started out in the Talmud, which is in the Gemara, which is the Remez level, digging deeper than the Peshat. And then we go to the Drash level in the Midrash Rabbah. And now we're getting to the Sod level, where the hidden, secret, mystical things, the sort of things that the rabbis tell us are in the book of Enoch, get expounded and discussed. Rabbi Isaac said, Uzzah and Azael fell from the abode of their sanctity above. They, their first estate, as we read in Kepha, I believe. They saw the daughters of mankind and sinned with them and begat children. These were the Nephilim, of whom it is said the Nephilim were in the earth. Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. Skipping a little bit ahead in the story, slightly here, but of necessity. Then, elsewhere in the Zohar, actually earlier, in volume 1, page 25b of the Zohar, it says, Of the Nephilim it is said, and the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair. Genesis 6:1. These form a second category of the Nephilim, already mentioned above in this way. When God thought of making man, he said, Let us make man in our image, etc. He intended to make him head over the celestial beings who were to be his deputies. Likewise, Joseph over the governors of Egypt. Genesis 41:41. The angels thereupon began to malign him and said, What is man that ye should remember him, seeing that he will assuredly sin before you? So, why is this human being so important to you? You know he's going to sin, he's going to transgress, because you know, you foreknow things, you know that's going to happen. Why is he so special that you want to put him over us? Said God to them, If you were on earth like him, you would sin worse. So, yeah, you're out of line here, because if you were put in his situation and you were in material bodies and you were living in a material world and exposed to the temptations that man is going to be exposed to, you would sin worse than he did, or he will. So don't talk to me about that. And so it was, for when the sons of God saw the daughters of man, they fell in love with them, and God cast them down from heaven. These were Uzzah and Azael, or, as we read in the book of Enoch, Shimei Chazah and Azael. And from them the mixed multitude derived their souls, and therefore they also are called Nephilim, because they fell into fornication with fair women. The book of Enoch, the book of the Zohar, the Zohar, volume 3, page 208a is the next text we will look at. And God cast Uzzah and Azael down from their holy place. They went astray after womenfolk and seduced the world also. It may seem strange that being angels they were able to abide upon the earth. The truth is, however, that when they were cast down, the celestial light which used to sustain them left them, and they were changed to another grade through the influence of the air of this world. Similarly, the manna which came down for all the Israelites in the wilderness originated in the celestial dew from the most recondite spot, and at first its light would radiate to all worlds and the field of apples, and the heavenly angels drew sustenance from it, angel food. But when it approached the earth, it became materialized through the influence of the air of this world and lost its brightness, becoming only like coriander seed. Now when God saw that his fallen angels were seducing the world, he bound them in chains of iron to a mountain of darkness. Uzzah he bound at the bottom of the mountain and covered his face with darkness, because he struggled and resisted. But Azael, who did not resist, he set by the side of a mountain where a little light penetrated. Okay. We'll read more about the judgment of Shemikazah and Azazel as the book of Enoch continues. So in some ways, some of these Zohar passages and passages from the rabbinic literature jumped ahead a little bit, but I wanted to present to you that in the rabbinic literature, this information from the book of Enoch is well known and affirmed and elaborated upon. How the angels obtained physical bodies and were able to copulate with the women. What caused them to sin in the first place. The Zohar tells us that these fallen angels had actually transgressed even earlier by questioning Elohim and rebelling against Elohim when Elohim wanted to make man master over. It was Elohim's plan to make man master over the angels, which will make sense as we read forward. It is Elohim's intent and plan that the angels are our servants. And this will get into spiritual warfare as we get further on into the book of Enoch, and we really begin to understand that that's our real place. Okay? And Paul talks about this in Hebrews, about the place man has over the angels. Okay, so we are intended to be masters over the angels. And these angels didn't like that. They thought that they were, hot stuff, and that man shouldn't be master over them. And Elohim said, and they said, we shouldn't be, because man is imperfect. He's going to sin. And so Elohim said, yeah, really? If you were in his spot, if you were tempted like him, you would sin too. And I guess that put the thought in their head. They decided, well, let's check, that thought didn't go away, and they pursued it. And in fact, maybe they went in and said, hey, let's have a look, let's see, maybe their original intent was to prove Elohim wrong, but then after they became physical bodies and they had the temptation, then they decided, hey, let's do it. And but at any rate, we get a bigger picture here by looking at these passages. So you may want to put, I recommend that in your study of the book of Enoch, you take these handouts and you put them in your in a notebook, and you just keep a notebook of our studies. All right, and our next handout, as the book of Enoch continues, our next handout is Leaders of the Fallen Angels. And it says 1 Enoch chapter 1 and 69. And I have a list here of all the names of the leaders. There's 20 names of leaders that are given, that are leaders over 10, so there's 200 of them. And each is a leader over 10. And all of their names in the actual Aramaic. There's one exception, and that is the name Tamiel, which we have preserved from the Greek as the best we can of that name. It hasn't survived in the Aramaic. Okay. Unfortunately, the worms were eating at the Aramaic text, and there's little bits and pieces of missing paper, or it's not really paper, but the animal skin, the material that the scroll was written on, and there's missing parts, and unfortunately that name didn't get preserved. So we have the others, and then we have Tamiel, which is probably our best shot at the Aramaic, what the Greek says at least. And you'll know that they are different if you have a translation that's made from the Ethiopic text, from the Ethiopic. We have Shemi Chazah, their leader, Artakif, the second to him, Ramtel, the third to him, Kakavel, the fourth to him, Tamiel, the fifth to him. Well, it's not too different from the Ethiopic, which has Tamel there. Ramiel, the sixth to him, Daniel, the seventh from him, Zikel, the eighth to him, Barakel, ninth to him, Asael, 10th to him, Harmoni, 11th to him, Matrel, 12th to him, Ananel, 13th to him, Sitwaal, 14th to him, Shemeshel, 15th to him, Saharel, 16th to him, Tamael, 17th to him, Turel, 18th to him, Yamael, 19th to him, and Zohariel, 20th to him. Now, I have to make a comment here about Zohariel. Zohariel, there's a conflict over whether this Aramaic word is Zohariel or Yadiel. Yadiel, the Dalet, or the D in Hebrew, looks very much like the R. They're almost indistinguishable in Hebrew and Aramaic. So, Milik read Yadiel. El is my guide. But Matthew Black read, in his translation, in his analysis, he read Zohariel, the splendor of El. So what I did, two reputable scholars, Matthew Black and Milik, are in dispute over what this, how this Aramaic word is to be read. So I got a photograph of the actual Aramaic fragment and examined it, and I'm certain that Matthew Black is correct. So the name is, in fact, Zohariel, 20th to him. So if you're looking at Milik's material or some material that has Yadiel for the 20th angel, that's not correct. It should be Zohariel. Okay, so these are the chiefs of tens, we're told, which parallels, by the way, the chieftains of the Hebrew tribes that we read about in the Torah, I believe in Exodus chapter 18. So Elohim's angels are arranged in that same parallel structure, apparently, and these are chiefs of tens. So we don't know the names of the 10 that they were each or 9, I guess, because they were each one of the 10 that they were each leader over, but there were 200 of them. And so let's look at their names. Each of the names here we have, and I have here in this handout, it says leaders of the fallen angels, 1 Enoch 1 and 69. Now in 1 Enoch 69 they're listed again. The Ethiopic terribly, completely mangles them, and the Greek has not survived for chapter 69. Neither has the Ethiopic. So when I did my translation of chapter 1 to where they belong in the Aramaic, in my translation of chapter 69. So that's why I have 1 Enoch 1 and 69. I believe I'm the only translation, I could be wrong, that has revised and corrected the names in chapter 69 based upon the Aramaic of chapter 1. All right, so Shemi Chazah means my name has seen. Artakef means the earth is mighty. Ramtel means burning ashes of El. Kokavel means star of El. Tamiel, we don't know. It could be in the actual Hebrew Tumiel, which would mean perfection of El. Ramael, thunders of El. Daniel, my judge is El. Zikiel, fireball of El. Barakel, lightning of El. Asael, the maker is El. Now this is an interesting one. We'll pause here at Asael, because we have this name Asael, but in the Aramaic in the Ethiopic it's Azazel, and in fact he comes back up in chapter 7 verse 1, I believe. Chapter 8 verse 1. Yeah, chapter 8 verse 1, and we read Asael in the Aramaic, okay, but the Ethiopic has Azazel. The Greek and the Aramaic both have Asael there. So we'll talk about that more when we get to it, but there's a question here. Is this Azazel under a different spelling, if you will, or a manipulation of the name? Perhaps after he sinned, he quit being Asael and he started being Azazel? Or is Asael and Azazel different guys? We'll talk about that as our study continues. Then we have Harmony, or of Harmon. Matrel, rain of El. Anan El, cloud of El. Sitwa El, winter of El. Shimshel, son of El. Saharel, moon of El. Tamiel, perfection of El. Turiel, mountain of El. Yamiel, day of El. And Zohariel, splendor of El. So these are the names of the leaders of these fallen angels. So let's go ahead and move on to chapter 7, verse 1. And all the others together with them took unto themselves wives from all, and each chose for himself one, and they began to go in unto them and to viol themselves with them, and they taught them sorcery and spellbinding and cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. And they became pregnant, and they bore giants, whose height was 3,000 cubits, and they were not born upon the earth children of their strength. Let's stop here for a moment. Let's go back up to verse 1. Here it says that these fallen angels, we have a shift in what it starts back up, and it says, and all others took took unto them wives from all. So not just the 20, but the 200 took wives. And they each chose for themselves one, and they began to go unto them and defile themselves with them. So they were copulating with them. And they taught them sorcery and spellbinding and the cutting of roots, and made them acquainted with plants. So the fallen angels also taught sorcery. That's very important. I want to now go back to the Zohar again. Volume 3, page 208. And this is actually following up. This is actually following up on one of the quotes that we had in our earlier page from the Zohar. In our earlier handout that said Uzzah and Azael in the Talmud, Midrash, and Zohar. There's a quote, and this picks up a longer version of the quote and covers more material. And God cast Uzzah and Azazel down from their holy place, and they went astray after the women folk, and seduced the world also. It may seem strange that being angels, they were able to abide upon the earth. So the Zohar is saying here that the reason that these angels found themselves on the earth looking at these ladies in the first place is because Elohim cast them down, and he cast them down partially as a punishment for questioning him, but also partially to prove to them that they were no better than man, that given the opportunity to sin, they would also, even worse. The truth is, and so the Zohar continues, the truth is, however, that when they were cast down, the celestial light which used to sustain them left them, and they were changed to another grade through the influence of the air of this world. Similarly, the manna, which came down from the Israelites for the Israelites in the wilderness, originated in the celestial dew from the most recondite spot, and at first its light would radiate to all worlds and the field of apples, and the heavenly angels drew sustenance from it. But when it approaches the earth, it became materialized through the influence of the air of this world and lost its brightness, becoming only like coriander seed. By the way, I'm reading from the handout that says at the top, fallen angels as teachers of sorcery. Now when God saw that these fallen angels were seducing the world, he bound them in chains of iron to a mountain of darkness. Uzzah he bound at the bottom of the mountain and covered his face with darkness because he struggled and resisted. But Azael, who did not resist, he set by the side of the mountain where a little light penetrated. Men who know where they are located seek them out, and they teach them enchantments and sorceries. They teach them enchantments and sorceries and divinations. These mountains of darkness are called the mountains of the east, and therefore Balaam said, "From Aram has Balak brought me from the mountains of the east," because they both learnt their sorceries there. Since Uzzah and Azael used to tell those men who came to them some of the notable things which they knew in former times when they were on high, and to speak with the holy world about the holy world in which they used to be. Okay. So here the Zohar is telling us that even later, even after they were exiled to darkness, and we'll get into that later in the book, even after they were exiled to darkness, men who knew how to seek them out, knew where they were, would seek them out and learn sorcery from them. So here we have a second witness, if you will, in the rabbinic literature, in the Zohar, that in fact these fallen angels were teachers of sorcery, and they taught Balaam his sorcery. And the Zohar, Volume 1, page 126a, in which place and from whom did Balaam derive all his magical practices and knowledge? Rabbi Isaac replied, he learned it from his father, but it was in the mountains of the east, which are in an eastern country, that he obtained a mastery of all the arts of magic and divination. From those mountains are the abode of the fallen angels, Uzzah and Azazel, with whom the Holy One cast down from heaven, who were chained there in fetters. It is they who impart to the sons of men a knowledge of magic. So, sorcery and magic were taught, and even today are still taught, by these fallen angels from their hidden abode in the darkness, men who know how to penetrate and seek them out and learn this information from them. And Balaam in particular, we're told, consulted these fallen angels. Now that's important because in the book of Jude, going back to the book of Jude here, I said we'd be continually looking back at the book of Jude and in 2 Peter. In the book of Jude, we read about these individuals that we spoke about earlier in verses 14 and 15, which are identified with those in the last days who teach this false teaching and promise liberty but deliver corruption and bondage, that teach that the Torah is not for today and doesn't have to be observed. And if we look up at verse 11 about these same individuals, we look up at verse 11 in the book of Jude. It says about these individuals, we'll start in verse 10. But these speak evil of whatever they do not know, and whatever they know naturally, like brute beasts. In those things they corrupt themselves. Woe to them, for they have gone the way of Cain, run greedily in the error of Balaam for profit, and perished in the rebellion of Korach. These are spots on your love feasts, while they feast with you without fear, tending only to themselves. They are clouds without water, carried about by winds, late autumn trees without fruit, twice dead, pulled by the roots, raging waves of the sea, foaming up their own shame, wandering stars, for whom is reserved the blackness of darkness forever. And we'll find out later that is a reference to something in the book of Enoch. And it says, Enoch, seventh of Adam, prophesied about these men, also saying, and then it quotes 1 Enoch 1:9. So Jude identifies the figures that are spoken of in 1 Enoch 1:9 as having followed in the error, what he calls here in verse 11, the error of Balaam. Verse 11. The error of Balaam. What is the error of Balaam? Well, the error of Balaam, according to the Zohar, was learnt from and came from listening and giving heed to the teachings of the fallen angels, the teachings of Shemi-Chazah and Azazel. So we have an agreement here between what Jude is saying, what the Zohar is saying, and what the book of Enoch is saying. And we can also turn here to the book of 2 Peter or 2 Kepha, chapter 3. Chapter 2, actually. And we said earlier that starting in verse 18, it's 18 through 22, Kepha is commenting upon these same people that that Jude talked about in Jude chapter 1, verses 14 through 15, that is actually quoting 1 Enoch 1:9. And if we go up just a little bit, we see, in starting in verse 4, well, we could go verse 12. But these, like natural brute beasts, made to be caught and destroyed, speak evil of the things that they do not understand, and will utterly perish in their own corruption. You know how many people I hear criticizing the Talmud, for example, the rabbinic writings, and then when I start questioning them and they don't even understand those writings. Many of them are criticizing the Talmud when they've never even never even seen a Talmud with their own eyes. They're just repeating what they've been taught, what somebody else said, what some anti-Semite website said, but they've never actually studied the Talmud to find out what the Talmud actually is and what it contains. They will receive the wages of unrighteousness as those who count it pleasure to carouse in the daytime. They are spots and blemishes, carousing in their own deception while they feast with you, having eyes full of adultery that cannot cease from sin, beguiling unstable nefeshot, souls. They have a heart trained to covetous practices and are accursed children. They have forsaken the right way, the Torah, and gone astray, following the way of Balaam ben Beor, who loved the wages of unrighteousness. And what was the way of Balaam? According to the Zohar, Balaam learned his way, his Torahless way, from the fallen angels. So the way of Balaam is the teaching of the fallen angels. But he was rebuked by his iniquity. A dumb ass speaking with a man's voice restrained the madness of the prophet. These are wells without water, clouds carried by a tempest, to which the gloom of darkness is reserved forever. For when they speak great swelling words of emptiness, they allure through the lust of the flesh, through perversion, those who have actually escaped from those who live in error. While they promise them liberty, they themselves are slaves of corruption, for by whom a person is overcome, by him also he is brought into bondage. So there's this last days group that will be influenced by the teachings of the era of Balaam. The era of Balaam being the teachings of the fallen angels. And this last days group will be teaching liberty and freedom, but promising liberty and freedom, but actually delivering only bondage, because sin is bondage, and one who is a servant of sin, becomes a servant of sin, is in bondage to sin. And that is exactly what the fallen angels were. They were in bondage to sin, and their message is a message of liberty, but it is actually a bondage to sin. And that is those whom the books of Jude and 2nd Kepha are addressed, or Yehuda or Jude and Kepha, 2nd Peter or 2nd Kepha, are addressed. These are individuals who are teaching the doctrine of the fallen angels, that is really promises liberty, but is really corruption and bondage. Okay, and so we're going to stop there this for today, and we'll pick back up in chapter 7, finish chapter 7. We'll probably review chapter 7 some more and go into chapter 8 in lesson 2. So let's go ahead and close for today, and we'll pick up next week in chapter 7. Verse 2. So we'll pick back up, and we'll actually just go back up we'll start chapter 7, verse 1 again, and we'll work our way through further into the book of Enoch. So I hope you've enjoyed our study of the book of Enoch, and that you will join us as we continue further into the book of Enoch, as we get into lesson 3, and we continue chapter 7 and go forward into the further chapters of the book of Watchers, the first portion of the book of Enoch, and our continued study together through the book of Enoch. Also, I'd like to remind you that these studies are paid for by those who, they're freely available, but they are paid for by those who choose to support these teachings with their tithes and offerings. And we need those of you who are willing to do that, to support these teachings, to step up to the plate and to support these teachings with your tithes and offerings. This kind of teaching is not readily available, and the major primary ministries, Christian or Jewish or whatever, they're not going to teach you line by line through the book of Enoch like this. And they're not going to do the kinds of teaching that this ministry does. So we need you to step up to the plate and be the ones that support this ministry. And you can do so by going to NazareneSpace.com or NazareneJudaism.com and clicking on the donation box and the PayPal box. And you can donate via PayPal, or you can send check or money order to P.O. Box to Nazarene Judaism, P.O. Box 471, Hurst, Texas 76053. And just make it out to Nazarene Judaism. So it's Nazarene Judaism, P.O. Box 471, Hurst, Texas 76053. Again, thanks for joining us, and I hope that you will continue to join us as we continue our studies together through the book of Enoch. Shalom.